Good evening. Tonight we're going to begin our several sessions on dreams at the request of one of our subscribers, Thomas. And in order to warm up for that, I thought the first two essays that are in this book, we're going to be using this book, C.G. Jung Dreams, with a foreword by Sonoshem Dasani, published by Princeton University Press. This book contains 5 or 6 essays by Dr. Jung, which spanned his entire career, including essays that appeared in volumes 4, 8, 12, and 16 of the collected works. And so this is a conglomeration of his thoughts about dreams. But because the first 2 essays that I'm going to address tonight go back to a time when Dr. Jung was very deep in his relationship with Dr. Freud before they broke up, I wanted to first, in this warm-up period, read to you something that came about 25 years later. And so I'll be reading from this book, Psychology and Alchemy by C.G. Jung. This is volume 12 of the collected works. And I'm going to first read to you paragraph 48. And as you probably know, Dr. Jung's paragraphs are pretty long. So this particular paragraph is a page and a half. And it's a warm-up to a series of dream analyses he did of the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli. And we probably will try to go through those dreams later in this series, but for tonight, because we're just starting, I'm going to read this paragraph. Paragraph 48. In my writings and lectures, I have always insisted that we must give up all preconceived opinions. And by the way, before I get any farther, what I'm reading is also on page 117 of this book. So if you want to follow along, you can. I'll resume here. Paragraph 48. In my writings and lectures, I have always insisted that we must give up all preconceived opinions when it comes to the analysis and interpretation of the objective psyche. In other words, the unconscious. We do not yet possess a general theory of dreams that would enable us to use a deductive method with impunity, any more than we possess a general theory of consciousness from which we can draw deductive conclusions. The manifestations of the subjective psyche or consciousness can be predicted to only the smallest degree, and there is no theoretical argument to prove beyond doubt that any causal connection necessarily exists between them. On the contrary, we have to reckon with a high percentage of arbitrariness and chance in the complex actions and reactions of the conscious mind. Similarly, there is no empirical, still less a theoretical, reason to assume that the same does not apply to the manifestations of the unconscious. The latter are just as manifold, unpredictable, and arbitrary as the former, must therefore be subjected to as many different ways of approach. In the case of conscious utterances, we are in the fortunate position of being directly addressed and presented with a content whose purpose we can recognize. But the unconscious manifestations, there is no directed or adapted language in our sense of the word. There is merely a psychic phenomenon. There is merely a psychic phenomenon that would appear to have only the loosest connections with conscious contents. If the expressions of the conscious mind are incomprehensible, we can always ask what they mean. But the objective psyche is something alien even to the conscious mind through which it expresses itself. We are therefore obliged to adopt the method we would use in deciphering a fragmentary text or on one containing unknown words. We examine the context. The meaning of the unknown word may become evident when we compare a series of passages in which it occurs. The psychological context of dream contents consists in the web of associations in which the dream is naturally embedded. Theoretically, we can never know anything in advance about this web, but in practice it is sometimes possible, granted long enough experience. Even so, careful analysis will never rely too much on technical rules. The danger of deception and suggestion is too great. In the analysis of isolated dreams, above all, this kind of knowing in advance and making assumptions on the grounds of practical expectation or general probability is positively wrong. It should therefore be an absolute rule to assume that every dream and every part of a dream is unknown at the outset, and to attempt an interpretation only after carefully taking up the context. We can then apply the meaning we have thus discovered to the text of the dream itself and see whether this yields a fluent reading, or rather whether a satisfying meaning emerges. But in no circumstances may we anticipate that this meaning will fit in with any of our subjective expectations, for quite possibly, indeed very frequently, the dream is saying something surprisingly different from what we would expect. As a matter of fact, if the meaning we find in the dream happens to coincide with our expectations, that is a reason for suspicion. For as a rule, the standpoint of the unconscious is complementary or compensatory to consciousness, and thus unexpectedly different. I would not deny the possibility of parallel dreams, i.e., dreams whose meaning coincides with or supports the conscious attitude, but, in my experience at least, these are rather rare. Okay, so that's paragraph 48. So after Dr. Jung's death, his heirs were rummaging through his materials, and they found this prefatory note to the English edition of this book, Psychology and Alchemy by C.G. Jung, volume 12 of the collected works, published by Princeton University Press. But this particular prefatory note had never been published before. And so in this, this was the eighth printing of the revised edition in 1993, apparently. It was included. Prefatory note to the English edition. To the reader who knows little or nothing of my work, a word of explanation may be helpful. Some 35 years ago, I noticed to my amazement that European and American men and women coming to me for psychological advice were producing in their dreams and fantasies symbols similar to and often identical with the symbols found in the mystery religions of antiquity, in mythology, folklore, fairy tales, and the apparently meaningless formulations of such esoteric cults as alchemy. Experience showed, moreover, that these symbols brought with them new energy and new life to the people to whom they came. From long and careful comparison and analysis of these products of the unconscious, I was led to postulate a collective unconscious, a source of energy and insight in the depth of the human psyche, which has operated in and through man from the earliest periods of which we have records. In this present study of alchemy, I have taken a particular example of symbol formation, extending in all over some 17 centuries, and have subjected it to intensive examination, linking it at the same time with an actual series of dreams recorded by a modern European not under my direct supervision, and having no knowledge of what the symbols appearing in the dreams might mean. It is by such intensive comparisons as this, and not one but many, that the hypothesis of the collective unconscious, of an activity in the human psyche making for the spiritual development of the individual human being, may be scientifically established. C.G. Jung. Now, when I first read this, as you can see, I put a lot of tabs on it, and as you see, I marked it up quite heavily because every one of those tabs indicates a place when I was reading it made me feel like I could write an essay only about that particular place in the book. And so there's quite a lot in it. But having said all that, we now have a few participants, so I will go on a little further. From my perspective, dreams are messages from the unconscious, and they are all meaningful in some way. The question is, can we catch them and can we understand their meaning? For example, all animals have unconscious attributes. Certainly all mammals have similar attributes to us, which warn them if there's a predator around. And you can see that in the simplest creatures, like an ant or something. If an ant or a spider feels something, they know that that's danger and they run away. Well, in the same sense, if an image of a predator flashes in your mind from the unconscious, that's certainly a suggestion that there may be a predator about. And the images that you have in your psyche depend on two things. They depend on images that were passed down to you through the DNA, and they're dependent upon images that you have taken in during your lifetime. And so I've many times referred to a dream I had when I was 6 years old of a dinosaur. I had been to a black and white movie with my parents that was about a Tyrannosaurus Rex that looked like a Tyrannosaurus Rex. But that night or shortly thereafter, when I was 6 years old, I had a dream of one of these very long-necked dinosaurs, which we do see in the museums of natural history and in various books or pictures of dinosaurs. So I take from that that was an image that was in my psyche through the DNA. It didn't come to me through that particular movie. It may have been constellated by that movie, but that creature I couldn't have seen. I never had exposure to dinosaurs before that time, and I never have any recollection of it, and unless there was cryptonesis, and we'll talk about cryptonesis a little bit later. And so in my case, and this happens with visions as well, in my case, I don't need a radar detector, because if I'm driving down the road and I get a vision of a police car, a black and white, going from right to left across my visual space with the word police written on the side of it, and it's always the same vision, if that vision comes to my mind, I know that there's police activity in the vicinity, and within a minute or two, certainly I will see police activity. Very often it's a speed trap. And so after long experience now, I know that when I have that vision, I should slow down and be careful about my P's and Q's and following the traffic laws. So I think that that's the way our unconscious sometimes communicates with us. And I've learned that that particular vision is always accurate. And so it's obviously keying on certain factors in my environment that I'm not consciously aware of. It may be differences in speed in the oncoming cars. It might have noticed that somebody flashed their lights or something like that, which I didn't consciously notice. But whatever it is, when that flashes, that's a version of a warning about a predator. And although I don't consider the police predators, but nonetheless, it's a vision that warns me to beware of this predator. And so I'm not accusing police of being predators, but I am saying that that's how my psyche warns me about speed traps and that sort of thing. So I've never had to have a radar detector. And so it's definitely true that dreams give us very vivid information. Now, it's up to us to decide what that vivid information means. And of course, there are many, many books in Barnes & Noble and on Amazon, like this one. This one is called The Book of Symbols, and it was edited by the Archive for Research in Archetypal Symbolism, and it has individual essays about all sorts of things, from dolphin, shell, falcon, whatever it is. And each of these essays is written by a set of Jungian analysts, so they're quite thorough. I was going to just let everybody pick somebody to pick a topic, and I would read that topic, but I decided, because I was paging through it and I saw this picture of Aphrodite of Rhodes, I thought I would read this section, which is about hair, and mainly because it has some personal relationship to me, which I'll explain. But my point is that it's almost useless to buy a dream book that tells you this means this or this means that. And the reason is because it could mean anything. Anything can almost mean anything in everybody's psyche. And so when I read this section on hair in a couple of moments, you'll see that they sort of threw everything about hair up against the wall. And so if you happen to have a dream about hair, yes, it might trigger something in your own mind that may help you explain your dream, but it isn't going to tell you that if you have a dream about hair, it means X. So just to go through the images that are here that are interesting. There are 4 images with this particular essay. So the first one is Samson's hair, which, quote, no razor had ever touched, unquote, is cut by the Philistines while he sleeps on the knees of the treacherous Delilah. With the cutting goes his superhuman strength. And so this is an image of Samson and Delilah by Carlo Cignani, 1628 to 1719, oil on canvas in Italy. Okay, so that's one that they included. Then there's this one, the Christian saint Mary Magdalene, cloaked in her red tresses, surrounded by the 8 stories of her life. Wood altarpiece at the Magdalene Master, by the Magdalene Master, about 1280 CE, Italy. Okay, so that's from Italy. I'll come back to that one in a moment because the actual essay refers to it. Then there's this image, and this says, the dramatic coiffure was probably inspired by the elaborate hairstyle worn by women of the Cross River region after entering adulthood. It's a crest mask of wood and animal skin, early 20th century Nigeria. And it says Cyber 49, whatever that is, SIEBER 49. And so that's the curly hair. And one more then, and this is the one that has meaning for me, and I'll come back to it in a moment. And so the caption of this image in this book is, like waves of the sea from which she originates, the locks of Aphrodite combed by their divine mistress, an image repeated for centuries by mythic mermaids and human women. Marble about 100 years BCE, Greece. Now, there's a lot more to this than I'm going to say right now, but I will come back to it. Okay, so now I'm going to come back to Mary Magdalene for a moment, and I'll read to you the essay. Okay, so my point about this essay, and these are very good essays, by the way, if you really need something to jog your thinking about what a specific feature of a dream means, you might get your thinking jogged by this, but it's not going to say this means this, as you'll see. Okay, so I'm on page 346, hair. Unadorned and disregarded by its owner, Mary Magdalene's flowing hair veils the chaste body of the penitent sinner, and at the same time conveys the faded heat of the former prostitute. Red hair, belonging to only 2 to 4% of the world's population, has signified erotic ardor and sexual looseness, fiery, typhoonic temperament, Mars-like anger, and the uncanniness of witch and devil. The red-haired virgin queen, Elizabeth I, made it for a time fashionable. The Inquisition viewed red hair as alien and suspect. Hair is incredibly potent. Its foot... Okay, so I'm going to take Mary Magdalene down here now. Okay. Reading on. Hair is incredibly potent. Its root follicles, fed by tiny blood vessels, lie invisibly under the skin, associating hair with interior, involuntary fantasies, thoughts, and longings. Hair tells us something about the state of one's head is in. Dirty, lice-ridden hair, unkept locks, have signified derangement, but also ascetical retreat and disregard of the worldly and bodily. The quiet curls of Buddha suggest enlightenment, tranquility. The quiet curls of Buddha suggest enlightened tranquility. Apollo is depicted with classically ordered sun-like locks of gold. Dionysus with hair dark, chaotic, tangled with wild grapevines. Harry Potter's black, unruly hair signifies unconventional ideas and magical powers. Hair carries DNA and thus codes race, ethnicity, and gender, but the cut of characteristics of a head of hair can also reveal individuality or conformity, freedom or inhibition, even religion, profession, political persuasion, and the idols of trendsetters with whom a person identifies. The vitality of hair is stunning because the cells in each strand are no longer alive once the hair surfaces. Cutting hair doesn't hurt, and strands that eventually fall out are constantly replaced by others, giving us on average 100,000 in all. Hair seems to have a life of its own. Like fingernails, it continues to grow after death. And ancient fossilized human bodies with heads of hair have a spooky aliveness. One of the first ways we register transformation is by something we do to our hair, and hair has ever played a part in initiatory process and major transitions. Coming of age rites have required the containment of the flowing hair of youthfulness, its covering with turban or scarf, or its ordering into complex constructions and adornment that signifies entrance into full membership and adult responsibility within the tribe or culture. Gray hairs evoke variously maturity, authority, wisdom, or waning. The short bob, adopted by women in the turn of the 19th century and coinciding with radical feminist movements, the invention of the bicycle and sacrifice of the corset, expressed greater freedom and self-determination. The long, braided hair of some Native American men is loosed at times of mourning. Among Hindu men, the hair is shaved, and the tearing, cutting, or veiling of hair are ways we show grief or mark separation. Hair, once covering our animal selves, is exquisitely sensual and magnetic. There is pleasure in stroking hair, feeling its weight and texture, combing it, decorating it. A man's hair is denoted strength, virility, youth, sexiness, and potency, of which he can feel robbed by baldness. A woman brushing her hair, knotting it, letting it cascade in a sign of receptiveness, running her fingers through her hair, tossing it like a horse's mane, or very short hair that regally enhances the shapeliness of the head that crowns the body. All these have become eternal images of beauty, fertility, seduction, creativity, spiritedness, and grace. There is also a shadow side. Heavenly angels were said to have been so attracted to the glorious hair of human women that they lusted after them, so that women were required to cover their heads in church or temple, connoting the relegation of their luminous thoughts and words to silence. In the Grimm's fairy tale Rapunzel, the young girl imprisoned in a tower by a sorceress has unnaturally long tresses that look like spun gold. She embodies the plight of a possessed or encapsulated soul, which, until it is freed, the golden potentiality for true symbolic imagination is replaced by idealized, illusory fantasizing, and the personality dreaming and isolated losses of ability to root in reality or live creatively in the world. And so this essay was by Donald Kalshed, The Inner World of Trauma, Archetypal Defenses of the Personal Spirit, London and New York, 1996, and by Roy Sieber et al., Hair in African Art and Culture, New York and Munich, 2000. Okay, so you see what I mean, that if you have hair in a dream, it can mean almost anything to your analyst. And so I want to come back to this one now. Thomas says, to seek concrete meanings for dream images is the conscious mind trying to superimpose reason on the unconscious dream offerings, yes. And reason versus imagination, I use the Dictionary of Symbols by Penguin. I'm not quite comfortable with that idea, Thomas, because I think that dreams and visions are more messages to us, and so we have to figure out what they mean. I mean, the imagery of our unconscious developed long before there was language, and it still works that way. And so I think it's simply our unconscious trying to tell us things. And yes, we can use reason and our experiences to talk about or to try to analyze what a dream means. But let's see, seek concrete meanings for dream images is the conscious mind trying to superimpose. So I wouldn't say I'm trying to superimpose reason on the unconscious dream offerings. I am trying to understand what the dream is trying to tell me. I know that it is archaic, and it comes from the 2-million-year-old man, as Dr. Jung would have it. And so I respect it in that way. I don't think of me trying to superimpose my reason on my dreams. I try to use my reason and intuition to understand what my dreams are saying. Thomas says, I was thinking that that's why active imagination works so well when working with dreams. Well, I think active imagination has to be allowed to happen. I don't think you can superimpose reason on it. Yeah, I think that I do agree with you. Thomas says, I meant more that the dream books do that imposing. I think that that's right, and I want to give you my own interaction with this particular image. And it's a very important image to me that's been a part of my life for 68 years. And so here, if you can see it, I'm not sure the light will allow this, but as you can see, I have a model of this image, and this image is known as Aphrodite of Rhodes. And this actual statue was discovered in the early 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, on the island of Rhodes, but in the harbor. It was pulled up by a fisherman covered with seaweed, and it was then dated back to the 1st century BC. And Aphrodite of Rhodes it has particular significance to me, and I'll come back to what you're saying, but I'm going to finish my little anecdote here. Aphrodite of Rhodes has a special meaning to me because in 1956, my father was a naval officer who was deployed in the Mediterranean, and his ship had a port call in Rhodes. And so he purchased a model like the one that I just showed you of this statue. And when he brought it home, the year must have been late 1948, or I'm sorry, late 1949 or very early 1950. I was no more than 3 years old, and my brother at the time was basically crawling, and he could climb up on furniture. He was 2 years younger than I was, and my father brought this statue home and gave it to my mother as a symbol of his love. And my mother put it on a telephone stand in our hallway, and I can still remember the scene, so it was quite emotionally impactful for me, obviously, quite a numinous moment. My brother crawled across the floor, tried to stand up on the telephone stand, rocked it, and the statue fell off and broke and into many pieces. My mother was crushed, and she was so upset that she spent all night trying to glue the statue back together again. And by morning, she had accomplished some semblance of that, put it back on the telephone stand, and once again, my brother did the same thing, and the statue was broken into many, many pieces. A second time, it was swept up and put in the trash. So, as I said, that happened late in 1949 or early 1950. In 2004, my wife and I were planning a trip that we were both doing business trips, and we decided that we would meet in Greece. And so we went to Athens, and my mother knew that we were going to Athens, and she said, "Oh, if you can possibly get a statue for me." And she described it as a woman combing her hair and holding her arms up like this. And I had it when she told me about that and the fact that it broke when my father brought it back to her, I remembered the incident. And so when I was in Greece, I went into a curio shop where they had lots of statues, and I described it. They didn't have one on the shelf, but when I described it, the owner had a catalog, and he pulled it out and he showed me Aphrodite of Rhodes, and sure enough, that's the statue. And so it so happened that he had two of them in inventory. I bought them both and brought this one back to my wife and one back to my mother. So no analyst could possibly know that without knowing that unique experience of mine. And so obviously, in terms of a psychoanalysis of me, they would need to know that in order to have any concept of what this statue means to me. So anyway, for what it's worth, that's Aphrodite of Rhodes. And as I say, she was in the harbor of Rhodes, Greece for about 1900 years. She's now in the Museum of Rhodes, and I happen to have gotten to go to Rhodes a few months later, myself, a few months after the Olympics of 2004, but unfortunately the Museum of Rhodes was closed, and that's kind of the story of my life. Anyway, so Dennis says, can we combine the conscious and the unconscious, much as one interprets images in a book like Finnegan's Wake? I certainly think that we are that, and that we have to learn how to live that. And if that's really what Dr. Jung's oeuvre is all about, is how to live the unconscious and the conscious together. But anyway, so that's the Book of Symbols. It's a very good book. It will give you whatever number, about 50 different ideas of what a particular symbol means, but then you're going to have to work it out what it means to you, because you might have a unique experience similar to what I discussed, and or not similar, but another one that's just as relevant. So I want to quote once again here now. I quoted this in the announcement about this session, but just a few lines here from Sonushan Dasani's foreword to the 2010 edition of this book, C.G. Jung Dreams, where he said, Jung's explorations led him to a new respect for the significance of dreams and the ambiguity of their language. Quote, I must learn that the dregs of my thought, my dreams, are the speech of my soul. I must carry them in my heart and go back and forth over them in my mind, like the words of the person dearest to me. Dreams are the guiding words of the soul. Dreams pave the way for life, and they determine you without you understanding their language. You would like to learn this language, but who can teach and learn it? And that was from the Red Book, page 233. And I presume when he says the Red Book, he's referring to the larger Red Book, but you'd have to check. 233. Okay, so now moving on, the first essay that I'm going to talk about tonight is the analysis of dreams, and this essay was written in 1909, and it is during the period when Dr. Jung was under the tutelage of Dr. Freud, and it is paragraphs 64. Let me see here. Paragraphs 64 to 94 of volume 4 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. So in paragraph 64, Dr. Jung says quite explicitly that he's presenting the principal results of Sigmund Freud's investigation. So these are not his views necessarily. In paragraph 65, he says, quote, the dream is an autonomous and meaningful product of psychic activity. Organic sensations are secondary. So, for example, if you wake up and there's a breeze blowing across you and you were dreaming of a wind in your dream, that can happen, but that's a secondary function. And it's the outcome of a logical process. It's a logical process within the unconscious. And dreaming has meaning like everything else we do. So in our psyches now, our psyche doesn't waste activity. It tells our heart to beat 72 times a minute. It tells us to breathe 12 times a minute. It tells us to eat and drink when we need to, and etc. It brings our attention to all our needs, and those are not wasted things. And in the same sense, then dreams and visions are the unconscious trying to get through to the conscious mind to pass along a message of some sort. Now, it may be a warning, or it may be a, yeah, go for that. And so it's up to you to decide which is correct, because you have to live in the 21st century. Your 2 million year old man in your unconscious does not have to. In paragraph 66, he says, Freud's supposition, the common experience that no psychic or physical fact is accidental, which just reiterates my point. And it's a complicated combination of phenomena, absolutely. So I think most people will say that when they have a big enough dream to remember, that that dream is very complete with colors and lots of imagery in the picture, very detailed imagery, etc. Paragraph 67, from an analyst's point of view, the question is, why does this particular person dream this particular thing? Now, that is relevant. And, quote, our present mental state depends on our history. So, as I said, there may be things that come up to you through the DNA, but there are other images that are in your psyche that are based on your personal experience in life, and therefore no one can predict it. I mean, nobody at the beginning of this session would have imagined that I would talk about this statue. Let's see. How can I get the statue to show here? There we go, so that you can see it. So I showed you that statue that is part of my life and has been for 68 years in one way or another. And most of those years, for 53 or 54 of those years, she was in my unconscious. But nonetheless, I do clearly remember that experience now from when I was 3 years old. So we all have a psychic constellation, which is different in everyone. It depends on innate and experienced images. And so I don't want to be repetitive here. I reminded myself to say a few things. Events which provoke strong emotional reactions are of great importance for our subsequent psychological development. These memories with a strong feeling tone form complexes of associations, which are not only enduring, but are very powerful and closely interlinked. I actually tried to tell a story about this statue a few months ago on video, and I found that I just couldn't do it. I mean, today I gave you the quick and simple version of this story, but when I tried to put the story together in an interesting way for video, I found that I was just blubbering so much. So there's obviously a very deep complex there that relates to my father's love for my mother, especially that I just couldn't do it. And so I put that aside. Somebody can find it in my collected belongings sometime, I suppose. So the complexes appear as the chief components of the psychological disposition in every psychic structure. In the dream, for example, we encounter the emotional components, for it is easy to understand that all the products of psychic activity depend above all upon the strongest constellating influences. So I described that, but I've had dreams around the deaths of various family members, for example, and I had dreams where my brother came to me twice after his death. They were dreams, but obviously it was a very emotional time when he died, which is now 30 years ago, believe it or not. And paragraph 69, dream material corresponds to the secret thought. Dr. Jung relates this to Faust by Goethe, and he describes Gretchen's dream and the ardent desire of her soul. And her ardent desire was that Faust be faithful, like the king in a poem that he recited. And it is always a question of wish and resistance to it. And I just observed that I think Dr. Jung moved away from wish fulfillment in his later work. In other words, in Dr. Freud's work, he says that a dream is a wish fulfillment. Dr. Jung moved basically entirely away from that idea later on. But in this essay, following Freud, all of our actions proceed from the wish that something should or should not come to pass. I don't believe that, and I don't think Dr. Jung believed that later in his career. Paragraph 70, if we cannot fulfill a wish in reality, we do in fantasy. Freud says that every dream represents the fulfillment of a repressed wish. So several times in this essay, Dr. Jung says, Freud says. So he's not necessarily endorsing it himself. He's reporting Freud's findings. And I think that in 1909, which is only 2 years after he and Freud started to collaborate, was also showing his own reservation about Dr. Freud's findings. And basically, Dr. Freud wanted to reduce everything to the sex instinct and to the Oedipus complex. And Dr. Jung acknowledges that Dr. Freud discovered the first archetype, which was the Oedipus complex, which amounts to the desire of young people to stay at home and not go out into the world. But it was the only one. He only acknowledged that Freud found that one archetype. And so anyway, in paragraph 71, then he says, Freud says that the wishes which form the dream thought are never desires which one openly admits to oneself, but desires that are repressed because of their painful character, i.e. Gretchen's doubt about Faust's faithfulness. And it is because they are excluded from conscious reflection in the waking state that they float up indirectly in dreams. Yeah, sort of. Sorry. Well, I think that I have a lot of dreams about things that I openly do desire and speak about regularly. Let's see. Thomas says, True Ray Jung moving away from wish fulfillment. He speaks more of compensation after the break with Freud. Yes, I agree with that. And thank you, off into dreamland. Goodbye, Michael. I hope I helped you sleep. Thomas says, Jung in this essay is still under Freud's sway, it seems. Yes, very much so. I mean, this is 1909, so he was 2 years into Freud's influence over him, let's say. And then Thomas says, I wonder why so many people, at least in my experience, will say dreams mean nothing and are not really disposed to delve into them or explore them. I think people are afraid of dreams. I mean, people have nightmares, and normally I know when I have a nightmare, it is with good reason, and I have to pay attention, and especially when I have a nightmare, I try very carefully to note down what its contents are. And I keep a dream book next to my bed, and whenever I have a dream and I can get myself awake enough so that I can write in it, then I write down the dream. And that's always a delicate balance, because often you say, oh, I want to go back to sleep. And if you do that, you'll probably lose the dream. And these dreams are quite important. They're very important. So I think people are afraid of their unconscious, and they're afraid to pay attention to it, very simply. And, I'm sorry about that, but that's the truth. And Thomas says, fear of the unconscious or fear of their own unconscious. I think it's both. I think that lots of people might be frightened of the concept of the collective unconscious, and yet the collective unconscious is what holds us together and pushes us apart in society. So we really need to understand that. Then there's this quote, the complexes appear as the chief components of the psychological disposition in every psychic structure. In the dreams, for example, we encounter the emotional components, for it is easy to understand that all the products of psychic activity depend above all upon the strongest constellating influences. So obviously, did I read that already? I guess maybe I did. Yep, okay. Sorry if that was repetitious, okay. So in paragraph 72, I have this note that dreams and visions are essentially the same. It's hard to distinguish from one another, and he talks about St. Catherine of Siena having a vision of her celestial marriage. Now, what I think is that this is a function of your psyche that is going on all the time. It's not just 3 times a night or 4 times a night. It's 7 by 24. But your conscious mind, your ego mind, overwhelms it most of the time. So it shouts it down, basically, or it's playing the music too loud so that you can't hear the messages from the unconscious. But when you're asleep, the unconscious can develop enough psychic energy to push these images up to a point where you can note them in your conscious mind, especially when you wake up after a dream. And also, if you have a vision when you're awake, that means your unconscious has really built up a psychic power and is pushing it out to make you pay attention. And I give my police car example as a good example, and one that I can recognize regularly. I mean, obviously, we all are thinking about things other than what's happening in our immediate room all the time. And most of those, most of the other things that are going on, we're just not aware of. But when they get pushed into our consciousness, that's because psychic energy has pushed through. So anyway, okay. In paragraph 73, Dr. Jung says, if we ask, the dreamer cannot tell why he dreamed X. Usually he has excuses from contemporary literature, like I ate too much or the wrong thing, I had heard it the day before, or I was lying on my back while sleeping. These are all excuses, but they don't really relate to what the dream activity actually is. The dream disguises the repressed complex to prevent it from being recognized. This is Freud's censor. And I just made my own comments that later work shows that this is not the case, or at least not only the case. And my point that I've been making all evening is that the dream has a message for you, and you may not get the message, but nonetheless, it's trying to tell you something that it thinks your conscious mind needs to know. And so it's worthwhile to pay attention to your dreams. Then paragraph 74, what must we do to get to the secret thought? Well, that's an issue. And in paragraph 75, Dr. Jung is saying at this point, Dr. Jung says direct questioning arouses a resistance. So for the analyst, when the analyst is trying to ask specific questions about a direct thing, there will be a resistance from the unconscious trying to prevent you from getting the answer. But the answer would reveal all, i.e. a love affair, a secret pregnancy. And so an analyst has to proceed prudently, because shocking things might be exposed and people have to be able to cope. Now, I had a note to myself to read a simple case for you, and so I will do that. I'm going to read paragraphs 77 and 78, and so these paragraph numbers are related to the paragraphs in volume 4 of the collected works, which also happen to coincide with the paragraph numbers next to the essays in this book, C.G. Jung Dreams. And so, all right, so paragraph 77. Here is an example of such a case. It concerns a man of whom I know nothing except that he lives in the colonies and happens at present to be in Europe on leave. During one of our interviews, he related a dream which had made a profound impression on him. 2 years before, he had dreamt that he was in a wild desert place, and he saw on a rock a man dressed in black covering his face with both hands. Suddenly he set out towards a precipice when a woman, likewise clothed in black, appeared and tried to restrain him. He flung himself into the abyss, dragging her with him. The dreamer awoke with a cry of anguish. Paragraph 78. The question, who was that man who put himself in a dangerous situation and dragged a woman to her doom, moved the dreamer deeply, for that man was the dreamer himself. 2 years before, he had been on a journey of exploration across a rocky and desert land. His expedition was pursued relentlessly by the savage inhabitants of that country, who at night made attacks in which several of its members perished. He had undertaken this extremely perilous journey because at that time life had no value for him. The feeling he had when engaging in this adventure was that he was tempting fate. And the reason for his despair? For several years he had lived alone in a country with a very dangerous climate. When on leave in Europe 2.5 years ago, he made the acquaintance of a young woman. They fell in love, and the young woman wanted to marry him. He knew, however, that he would have to go back to the murderous climate of the tropics, and he had no wish to take a woman there and condemn her to almost certain death. He therefore broke off his engagement after prolonged moral conflicts which plunged him into a profound despair. It was in such a state of mind that he started on this perilous journey. The analysis of the dream does not end with this statement, for the wish fulfillment is not yet evident, but as I am only citing this dream in order to demonstrate the discovery of the essential complex, the sequence of the analysis is without interest for us. Okay, so that was an example of a dream. And then in paragraph 79, Dr. Jung says, when resistances are great, Freud created the psychoanalytic method, a valuable instrument for resolving or overcoming the most tenacious resistances. So, okay. Then in paragraph 80, the method to pick apart a dream, what associations. So you select anything, you select any part of the dream and ask the person or ask yourself, what associations do you have with that fact in the dream? Normally, you are all characters in the dream, believe it or not. And so what are the associations you have with all the different players in the dream and with any detail that you notice in the dream? For example, I was reading about hair, so what are the associations if you noticed hair in the dream? What are the associations that you have with hair? And the other thing is that you have to ignore the criticism of the association. That's the censor, and it tends to repress what is most important about the dream. In paragraph 81, then, subject says everything that comes toward oneself, one has the greatest resistances. And then I have a note to myself to read another dream analysis. I'm doing this because I just don't feel able to, in a thumbnail, explain what Dr. Jung was saying. So I'm going to read paragraphs 82 to 93 to you, which contains another dream, and I'll leave it up to you to determine what you think of it. So, paragraph 82, a gentleman of whose intimate life I was ignorant told me the following dream, quote, I found myself in a little room seated at a table beside Pope Pius X, whose features were far more handsome than they were in reality, which surprised me. I saw on one side of our room a great apartment with a table sumptuously laid and a crowd of ladies in evening dress. Suddenly I felt a need to urinate, and I went out. On my return, the need was repeated. I went out again, and this happened several times. Finally, I woke up wanting to urinate. So that was the dream. Paragraph 83, the dreamer, a very intelligent and well-educated man, naturally explained this to himself as a dream caused by irritation of the bladder. Indeed, dreams of this class are always so explained. Paragraph 84, he argued vigorously against the existence of any components of great individual significance in this dream. It is true that the facade of the dream was not very transparent, and I could not know what was hidden behind it. My first deduction was that the dreamer had a strong resistance because he put so much energy into protesting that the dream was meaningless. Paragraph 85, in consequence, I did not venture to put the indiscreet question, why did you compare yourself to the Pope? I only asked him what ideas he associated with Pope. The analysis developed as follows. Pope, the Pope lives royally, a well-known student song. Note that this gentleman was 31 and unmarried. Seated beside the Pope, just in the same way I was seated at the side of the sheikh of a Muslim sect, whose guest I was in Arabia. The sheikh is a sort of pope. The Pope is a celibate, and the Muslim a polygamist. The idea behind the dream seems to be clear. I am a celibate like the Pope, but I would like to have many wives like the Muslim. I kept silent about these conjectures. The room and the apartment with the table laid. They are apartments in my cousin's house, where I was present at a large dinner party he gave a fortnight ago. The ladies in evening dress. At this dinner, there were also ladies, my cousin's daughters, girls of marriageable age. Paragraph 87. Here he stopped. He had no further associations. The appearance of this phenomenon, known as a mental inhibition, always justifies the conclusion that one has hit an association which arouses strong resistance. I asked, and these young women? Oh, nothing. Recently one of them was at F. She stayed with us for some time. When she went away, I went to the station with her, along with my sister. Paragraph 88. Another inhibition. I helped him out by asking, what happened then? I was just thinking. This thought had evidently been repressed by the censor, that I had said something to my sister that made us laugh, but I have completely forgotten what it was. Paragraph 89. In spite of his sincere efforts to remember, it was at first impossible for him to recall what this was. Here we have a very common instance of forgetfulness caused by inhibition. All at once he remembered, quote, on the way to the station we met a gentleman who greeted us and whom I seemed to recognize. Later I asked my sister, was that the gentleman who is interested in the cousin's daughter, ? Paragraph 90. She is now engaged to this gentleman, and I must add that the cousin's family was very wealthy and that the dreamer was interested too, but he was too late. The dinner at the cousin's house. I shall shortly have to go to a wedding of two friends of mine. The Pope's features. The nose was exceedingly well formed and slightly pointed. Who has a nose like that? Laughing, he said, a young woman I'm taking a great interest in just now. Was there anything else noteworthy about the Pope's face? Yes, his mouth. It was a very shapely mouth. Laughing, another young woman who also attracts me has a mouth like that. Paragraph 91. This material is sufficient to elucidate a large part of the dream. The Pope is a good example of what Freud would call a condensation. In the first place, he symbolizes the dreamer, celibate life. Secondly, he is a transformation of the polygamous sheikh. Then he is the person seated beside the dreamer during a dinner, that is to say, one or rather two ladies, in fact, the two ladies who interest the dreamer. Paragraph 91, but how comes it that this material is associated with the need to urinate? To find the answer to this question, I formulated the situation in this way, quote, you were taking part in a marriage ceremony and in the presence of a young lady when you felt you wanted to pass water. Quote, true, that did happen to me once. It was very unpleasant. I had been invited to the marriage of a relative when I was about 11. In the church, I was seated next to a girl of my own age. The ceremony went on rather a long time, and I began to want to urinate, but I restrained myself until it was too late. I wetted my trousers, unquote. Paragraph 93. The association of marriage with the desire to urinate dates from that event. I will not pursue this analysis, which does not end here, lest this paper should become too long, but what has been said is sufficient to show the technique, the procedure of analysis. Obviously, it is impossible to give the reader a comprehensive survey of these new points of view. The illumination that the psychoanalytic method brings to us is very great, not only for the understanding of dreams, but for that of hysteria and the most important mental illnesses. Okay, so that's that dream. And so at the end of this essay, then, Dr. Jung recommends two of Freud's works, both of which I have read and also recommend. The first is The Interpretation of Dreams, and the second is Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious. Think about it. What is a comedian doing? Well, comedians bring into our conscious mind things that are in our shadow, and those make us laugh or make us squirm in uncomfortableness or whatever it is. Okay, so the second essay that I wanted to cover tonight is the significance of number dreams. And in this dream, Thomas has already commented at the beginning of the chat here that he felt that this analysis was a bit too much of a stretch, and I do agree with him. But it's really an amazing analysis, so I'm going to again read parts and show you the numbers that Dr. Jung was involved with. And so in paragraph 129, again, we're in volume 4, but this is paragraph 129 of volume 4, and the title of the essay is On the Significance of Number Dreams. And again, this essay is from 1910-1911, so it's still under the thumb of Dr. Freud. So I'm just going to read this dream because it's rather complex and the analysis is rather complex, and I will gradually give you some numbers to look at. So, paragraph 130, the first three examples are from a middle-aged man whose conflict of the moment was an extramarital love affair. The dream fragment from which I take the symbolic number is, quote, the dreamer shows his season ticket to the conductor. The conductor protests at the high number on the ticket. It was 2477. The analysis of the dream brought out a rather ungentlemanly reckoning up to the expenses of this love affair. which was foreign to the dreamer's generous nature. His unconscious made use of this in order to resist the affair. The most obvious interpretation would be that this number had a financial significance and origin. A rough estimate of the expenses so far involved led to a number which in fact approached 2477 francs. A more careful calculation gave 2387 francs, a number which could only arbitrarily be translated into 2477. I then left the number to the free association of the patient. It occurred to him that in the dream the number appeared divided, 24 space 77. Perhaps it was a telephone number. This conjecture proved incorrect. The next association was that it was a sum of various other numbers. At this point, the patient remembered telling me earlier that he had just celebrated the 100th birthday of his mother and himself. Since she was 65 and he was 35, their birthdays fell on the same day. In this way, he arrived at the following series of associations. So here is the series of associations. He was born on February 26th, his mistress on August 28th, his wife on March 1st, his mother, his father was long dead, on February 26th, his two children on April the 29th, and July the 13th. He was born in February 1875, his mistress in August of 1885. He was now 36, his mistress 25. In this series of association, if this series of associations is written down in the usual figures, we get the following sum. So I have to show you the other way of looking at this. Okay, so here's the sum, and so as you see, February 26th comes out as 26.2, August 28th comes out as 28.8, and so on, and abracadabra, abracadabra, the total is 2477. How about that? Paragraph 133. This series, which includes all the members of his family, thus gives the number 2477. Its composition led to a deeper layer of the dream's meaning. The patient was greatly attached to his family, but on the other hand, very much in love with his mistress. This caused him severe conflicts. The details of the conductor's appearance, omitted here for the sake of brevity, pointed to the analyst from whom the patient both feared and wished firm control, as well as sharp censure of his dependent state. Paragraph 134. The dream that followed shortly afterwards ran much abbreviated. The analyst asked the patient what he actually did when he was with his mistress. The patient said he gambled, and always on a very high number, 152. The analyst remarked, "You are sadly cheated." Paragraph 135. An analysis once more revealed a repressed tendency to reckon up the costs of the affair. The monthly expenses amounted to close to 152 francs, actually between 148 and 158. The remark that he was being cheated alluded to the point at issue between himself and his mistress. She asserted that he had deflowered her, but he was quite convinced that she was not a virgin and had already been deflowered by someone else at a time when he was seeking her favors and she was refusing him. The word number led to the association size in gloves or size of caliber. From there, it was but a short step to the fact that he had noted at the first coitus a remarkable width of the opening instead of the expected resistance of the hymen. This seemed to him proof of deception. The unconscious naturally used this discovery as a most effective means of resistance against the relationship. The number 152 proved refractory at first to further analysis, but on a later occasion it led to the not-so-distant idea of a house number, followed by these associations. When he first knew her, the lady lived at 17X Street, then at 129Y Street, then at 48Z Street. Paragraph 136. Here the patient realized that he had already gone far beyond 152, for the total was 194. It then occurred to him that for certain reasons the lady had left 48Z Street at his instigation, so the total must be 194 minus 48 equals 146. She was now living at 6A Street, since it was 146 plus 6 equals 152. Okay, so that's a convoluted example, and there is another convoluted example here, and I'm going to leave that one to your own reading in the book. But I want to go to yet another dream, which begins at paragraph 146. And this is also quite interesting. Now, keep in mind, at this period of time in history, people were very interested in the idea of numerology, and there were a lot of mystics or numerologists who were doing all kinds of crazy things with numbers. And of course, most of us come up with some number that we consider our lucky number, or are superstitious about numbers like 13 and that sort of thing. So we all have numbers that are bugaboos in our unconscious. Thomas says, one can see where certain numbers would have deeper meanings. 40 for a Christian would have echoes of the numerous 40s in the Bible. 108 would have meaning for a Hindu, pagan 7 or 13. And Thomas says, the analyst Jung and his analysand follow, however, borders of gematral. I go, what is gematral? Can you give us a definition of gematral, Thomas, while I read this other dream now? Okay, so I'm going to read paragraphs 146 to 152. It is particularly interesting to see how the problems of the patient were mirrored in the unconscious of his wife. His wife had the following dream. She dreamt, this is the whole dream, Luke 137. That was the entire dream, Luke 137. Analysis of this number showed that she associated as follows. The analysis had gotten one more child. The analyst had gotten one more child. He had 3. If all her children, counting the miscarriages, were living, she would have 7. Now she only had 3 minus 1 equals 2, but she wants 1 plus 3 plus 7 equals 11, a twin number, 1 and 1, which expresses her wish that her 2 children had been pairs of twins, for then she would have had the same number of children as the analyst. Her mother once had twins. The hope of getting a child by her husband was very precarious, and this had long since implanted in the unconscious the thought of a second marriage. Other fantasies showed her as finished at 44, i.e., when she reached the climacteric. She was now 33, so there were only 11 more years to go till she was 44. This was a significant number, for her father died at his 44th year. Her fantasy of the 44th year thus contained the thought of her father's death. The emphasis on the death of her father corresponded to the repressed fantasy of the death of her husband, who was the obstacle to a second marriage. At this point, the material to Luke 1:3-7 comes in to help solve the conflict. The dreamer, it must be emphatically remarked, was not at all well up in the Bible. She had not read it for an incredible time. She had not read it for an incredible time and was not in the least religious. It would therefore be quite hopeless to rely on associations here. Her ignorance of the Bible was so great that she did not even know that Luke 1:3-7 could refer only to the Gospel according to St. Luke. When she turned up the New Testament, she opened it instead to the Acts of the Apostles. As Acts 1 has only 26 verses, she took the 7th verse. It is not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father hath put in his own power. But if we turn to Luke 1:37, we find the Annunciation of the Virgin. Quote, "The Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the power of the Highest shall overshadow thee. Therefore also that holy thing which shall be born of thee shall be called the Son of God. And behold, thy cousin Elizabeth, she hath also conceived a son in her old age, and this is the 6th month with her, who was called barren. For with God nothing shall be impossible." The logical continuation of the analysis of Luke 1:3-7 requires us also to look up Luke 13:7. There we read, "A certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came and sought fruition thereon, and found none. Then said he unto the dresser of his vineyard, Behold, these 3 years I come seeking fruit on this fig tree, and find none. Cut it down. Why cumbereth it to the ground?" The fig tree, since ancient times a symbol of the male genitals, must be cut down on account of its unfruitfulness. This passage is in complete accord with the numerous sadistic fantasies of the dreamer, which were concerned with cutting off or biting off the penis. The illusion of her husband's unfruitful organ is obvious. It was understandable that the dreamer withdrew her libido from her husband, for with her he was impotent, and equally understandable that she made a regression to her father, which the Father hath put in his own power, and identified with her mother, who had twins. By thus advancing her age, she put her husband in the role of a son or boy of an age when impotence is normal. He can also understand her wish to get rid of her husband, as was moreover confirmed by her earlier analysis. It is therefore only a further confirmation of what has been said if, following up the material to Luke 1:37, we turn to Luke 7:13. Quote, "Now when he came nigh to the gate of the city, behold, there was a dead man carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said unto her, Weep not. And he came and touched the bier, and they that bare him stood still. And he said, Young man, I say unto thee, arise. In the particular psychological situation of the dreamer, the allusion to the raising up of the dead man acquires a pretty significance as the curing of her husband's impotence. Then the whole problem would be solved. There is no need for me to point out in so many words the numerous wish fulfillments contained in this material. The reader can see them for himself. Since the dreamer was totally ignorant of the Bible, Luke 1:3-7 must be regarded as a cryptomnesia. Both Flournoy and myself have already drawn attention to the important effects of this phenomenon. So far as one can be humanly certain, any manipulation of the material with intent to deceive is out of the question in this case. Those familiar with psychoanalysis will know that the whole nature of the material rules out any such suspicion. And the definition of cryptomnesia is reappearance of a suppressed or forgotten memory which is mistaken for new. So Dr. Jung is saying that Luke 1:3-7 was something that this woman knew of but didn't remember. And so he concludes this essay with, these speculations are on a sea of uncertainty. So this is very early in his career, and there are a lot of uncertainties involved in these two particular essays, which related to his time with Freud. So Thomas responds, Gematria is a Kabbalistic method of interpreting the Hebrew scriptures by computing the numerical value of words based on those of their constituent letters. Gematria originated as an Assyro-Babylonian Greek system of alphanumeric code or cipher. He credits Wikipedia. Perhaps I should have said numerology, he says. And, this is very complicated stuff, no doubt. Are you sorry that you asked now? Because this is, anyway. One thing that is quite interesting here is this series of dreams that Wolfgang Pauli had, which Dr. Jung interpreted as a series coming up in an individuation process. So since individuation is so important to Jungian psychology, I will attempt in some future session to address that. Now, let me see what is next week. So next week I will attempt to deal with general aspects of dream psychology, which is from 1948, and also on the nature of dreams, which also is from 1948. And so that will be from pages 21 to 84 or so of this book. And we'll continue on to do a series on dreams until we work through this. Are you sorry you asked? Anyway, I've now talked out my voice, but if there are any other comments or questions about these two essays or the comments that I personally gave during the session, I'd be happy to address them now. And if not, we'll move on to this part 2 of this book. There's 4 parts of the book. Part 1 was dreams and psychoanalysis, which we've done. Part 2 is dreams and psychic energy. Part 3 is, and so part 2 we'll try to do next week. Part 3 is the practical use of dream analysis. And then part 4 is individual dream symbolism in relation to alchemy. Now, that is the Pauli material, and that goes on for 200 pages. So that part 4, I don't think we're going to do in 1 week, but I'll do what I can. Thomas says, serial dream seems to be quite important. My analyst said it was as though the unconscious was tweaking the main theme as it repeated in different dreams. You didn't get it that time. So again, yeah, I guess that's true. I think, occasionally I do have a repeat dream. I did have a dream that really spooked me out when I was in high school, because when I lived in Kodiak, we were around the king crab industry. The town of Kodiak, which had mainly Inuits in it, their main business was crabbing for king crabs, and these king crabs were quite large. And at some point while we were in Kodiak, my parents took me to a movie that was something like The Crab Island or something like that, and it was a horror movie, and it was about crabs coming up on the shore and attacking the people, and that made quite an impression on me. And that movie had a building in it which was like a factory. And when I went to Japan about, must have been about 10 years later, I was in high school, and the school bus route, this was a U.S. Navy bus that would pick me up out in the Japanese economy and take me to my U.S. Navy high school. But it was a long trip. It was about an hour trip each way. And the bus route went right past a building that reminded me exactly of that dream. And so I got reminded of that dream every day for 2.5 years. So the factory from Crab Island, I'm sure it had nothing to do with crabs, but anyway, it was a spooky experience. It's like deja vu all over again. So anyway, okay. So I think we may have covered it for today. I will do my best to prepare part 2 for next week, and we'll try to do a thorough job on dreams. Then that may take us a few more weeks. So Thomas says, my lifelong serial dream has been upon a theme of return or finding home. No resolution, but I work on them as they come. Well, we all need to work on our dreams. That's what inner work is about. And you can, in part, you can work on them with active imagination. But let me emphasize that active imagination is not you imagining and forcing some fantasy onto a dream situation. It means that you write down as much of the dream as you can remember. And then in a conscious state, after the dream, you allow it to continue and come to you. If you fantasize it, then that's just a fantasy. That's not a dream or a vision. But if you let it come to you, then it opens out to you. And so I do have an example on the site. Let me see if I can find it very quickly. It's the dream in the sheriff's office, for any of you who may remember that. I think I can find the link to it quickly, though, in case you're interested, because I had this dream, and it was quite a vivid dream, and I let it run into active imagination, so you'll get what came out, but I need to find it. And by the way, everyone should look at the homepage of this YouTube channel, because I've put together quite a lot of material that can be interesting to you beyond just this. Dream in the sheriff's office. Let's just see if that gets it. Yep, okay, here it is. So I need to get the link. Okay, so this is called Skip's Dream in the Sheriff's Office, and this is the link, and it's in that discussion you hear when I switch between recounting the dream and go into the active imagination, which was conscious, and that all just emerged naturally from me. I didn't force it in any way. And so if you're doing an active imagination, that's what you need to do. You need to allow the unconscious to present you with material and just accept it. Whatever it is, it is. Just write it down and keep accepting it. And, you know, I wrote an entire novel that way, but beyond that, you know, I've had many other active imaginations over time, and, you know, that's the way it works. It doesn't work by creating a fantasy world. And so, anyway, I hope that's helpful, and nice to have you all here, and I'll talk to you all soon. I'm going to log off at this point. And so...